Hello, welcome to the queue for another installment of Combat Theater. We had a intro video, animation video that my son put together at the beginning, and if you can guess what movie we're trying to spoof there, go ahead and put that in the comments. We'll see if anyone gets it. The hint is it is a war movie, and the game is HBG's Midway, and it was released earlier this spring, maybe late spring, but either way, it's the game for the Japan facing off against the US for carrier dominance in the Pacific. And it did not go Japan's way. We have played the game numerous times now, and we've been able to get some different endings to, not necessarily historical endings. But also there's been several games where the US has completely destroyed Japan as far as the carriers, and it actually ends up historical. But there are some Japanese wins in there, so don't fear if you're the Japanese player, you've got no chance. That's not true in the game. It starts out in a historical setting, but from there, you make your decisions and go from there and see if you can win as Japan. Or if you're US, continue on to the historical path and crush the Japanese. I filmed the first game already, and it's already edited and ready to go, so now I'm filming the intro second, which is kind of a little weird. You would film the intro and a little bit of rules first, but as it worked out, I had the game, played the game and videoed it to see how it went, and it's a little longer than most, but I kind of give the first couple turns, play by play, move by move, following the little order of play chart. But as the game goes on, I pare it down and weed out some stuff. But some people want to see the detail, which if I'm gonna maybe purchase a game, I kind of want to see how it's played detail wise, and then you can pick up maybe some strategy hints on getting started, and then work your own strategy from there. But like I said, as I get near the end, I kind of weed out and edit out some stuff so that you're not spending 6 years watching the video. Now the game itself, if you were playing it and not videoing it, you can get it done in that 2 to 3 hour range. A really good contest will hit 4 hours. Really, the only ones that are at the 2 hour mark are when the U.S. wins in a historical fashion and wipes Japan off the board. Those two games that have happened that way have been right at. I think one was an hour and a half, and then one was 2 hours. But it's all a matter of how the tokens are drawn out of the cup and how the dice roll, and that's what makes the game not the same play through each time you play, it's just one of the reasons why I like it. And we're going to do a second game, hopefully here later today, where we're going to play it blind. And when I say that, it's, remember the old battleship game where you didn't see the other team's ships and you were guessing where they are? Well, that's what we got set up here. And we'll go through a little intro on that with the changes that we made, some house rules to get it to play in such a manner, and we'll see how that goes. And then interestingly enough, I know of 2 other people that are doing the same thing, so it'll be interesting to see what rules they came up with to make it play blind, versus what we're doing here, and maybe we all combine at some point and pick the best rules, for the best version, because I think, if you don't know where the other team's ships are, that adds a new element to the game that'll be pretty fun. So let's get to some rules and some gameplay. So let's look at not necessarily the whole rule book, but some of the key points in there. Plenty of good reading there. So we'll get that off to the side. The first part that is kind of critical is not the setup chart, but on the back of the US and Japanese setup charts is this order of play, and it lists out each step of every phase. of a full turn. And my recommendation is that you follow it to the letter. We tried reading that and remembering it, trying to play it, and it caused a lot of grief because we got things out of order, certain things we didn't understand. But when you follow it point by point, you know, right down the line, it plays really well. So at some point I suppose you would remember it, but even after the 8 or 9 or 10 games that we've played, we still have learned just to go down the list. It's just easier. So the first item there on the list of every phase is to check for victory conditions. Well, no need to go over that. If the victory points are equal 12, then that side is won. Then the next thing is the command tokens, and the U.S. has 4, Japan has 4 as one rolls away, and then there is a storm token, and then there's metal, which is the end of the round. And Japan gets 1 token for each carrier that is functional. The U.S. has 3 carriers and then 1 for Midway. So if Midway's air base is knocked out, then they just lose a token. So how you go about doing this, the tokens, you determine at that point of the game how many tokens. So turn 1 is a special turn. Each side starts with 2. They draw them out, then they add all the rest, and then they go from there. So they'll draw until they get, well, I guess I should have kept that metal token out. You basically, you draw until you get that metal token. But that is later on in the steps. Right now we're just determining how many tokens, command tokens. So the maximum commands you can have in a turn is 4. And the things you can do with a command is move your ships, launch your aircraft, and really those are the 2 things that you can do. And sometimes, well, most times you don't get all 4 in a turn. So the next item on there is determining your carrier operations. So you've got these carrier sheets, 1 for Japan, 1 for US, and there's a box on the front of each of the carriers that has their operational status. So this carrier division here would be here, and it has these 2 planes that are out of fuel. So we've got those there. They're out of fuel. So this carrier division, which would be these 2 carriers, the orange and the red, they match the chip, would have to set their carrier status to recover. The US, having its carrier, and we'll set it there for the purpose of the demonstration here, and it has a it's not a blue, it's a green fighter. So it has a green fighter that is out of fuel. So from that, you're going to set that green carrier to recover. So those are the ones you have to do. If you've got planes out of fuel in the C zone with the carriers, they have to land. So that's where you get into a situation where if the enemy's planes are coming into attack and these planes have landed, then you got some extra damage, you know, on your carriers if they get hits, you know, with planes on the flight deck. So the other option is launching planes. So say the blue carriers here and the black carrier, which is the Hornet and the Enterprise, they've got these planes. Say you want to launch, so you can launch up to 5 per carrier that is undamaged. For every damage you have, it would be 1 less. So 2 damage, you can only launch 3 planes. But for demonstrations, we're going to launch 1 on each. So you move 1 up to the carrier deck, the flight deck, to take off. So that's your carrier ops. These carriers here are going to move, so you'd leave nothing there. So they would be whatever C zone they're in. They're going to hopefully use one of those tokens to move to another C zone. And there's reasons that you would do that, to get away from the enemy or get away from being spotted, or if you're fleeing into the storm. So the next one, you spot the aircraft on the deck. So these are spotted on the deck. to be launched. Then the next and last phase, or portion of phase 1, is landing aircraft. So now you're going to take these planes that are out of fuel and land them, I guess it'd be the dive bomber, and then this would be a fighter. So you're going to land them onto the carrier deck. So those carriers already have planes on the deck. These planes or carriers have planes on the deck. So any attack on any of these carriers would be not devastating, but you got that extra damage for having planes on. Now these two could launch if the US draws 2 tokens. So that would be the end of phase 1, the command and operations phase. Phase 2 is the search operations. So the US would have a patrol aircraft that would be in that C zone, and Japan would have one there, and they could fly 2, so they could be away. So they would fly into the C zone. So you would launch and move your patrol aircraft for phase, or for the first part of the phase. The second part of the phase is to roll. So for your searching, the US would roll 2, Japan would roll 1, and the highest dice wins. And then it's vice versa for, Japan going there. So you roll the dice, whoever has the highest dice wins. So say this one here lost, this US fighter or patrol aircraft lost that dice roll. You just put an out of fuel marker on it, and then it has to return to base. So it has failed its mission. As the patrol planes succeed, like this is Japan, if it succeeded, then on the next turn it could try to shadow this force and it would get an extra dice. And you'd think 3 on 1 is brutal, but a lot of times you fail on those rolls and you lose contact, and then that messes up all your flight operations. So those are the only 2 steps on phase 2 for conduct search operations. Phase 3 is execute orders. So all the turns except for turn 1 are the same. You've got all your command tokens in here, and you just draw one out. Oh, first one is US. So the US would place this token and launch this plane, or up to 5 planes, and they can fly. Well, a torpedo bomber can only fly 2. So let's say it flies there. You put your marker there and you put your fuel. Each plane it launches has a maximum of 3 fuel. So then you draw another token. Japan, they would move their carrier, so to speak. US would go again. So they would launch this dive bomber from the Hornet there. So they would have those 2 planes, or 2 groups of planes, flight groups, in the air with 3 fuel. And actually the dive bomber could go 3. So it could actually move up there, and then we would need a separate fuel marker for it. And it's not working properly. Alright, so that's what that would look like. And then let me just get to, well, here's the storm. So if you draw the storm marker, you start it there in C zone 3. Pretty simple. If you draw it the next turn, then whoever drew it gets to choose one of the zones next to it until you filled up the top zone, and then you start working on the second row. And quite often that gets to the second row. And then whenever this metal token is drawn, then that is the end. So if this was the case, then Japan got 1 move and the US got 2 moves. So if you had planes to launch from this 3rd carrier as the US, you can't do it. Or if you had any planes, landing planes cost you nothing. That's the good news. So after the tokens are drawn, then you would go into the combat sequence. Well, phase 4, the combat sequence, there's no combat here as the planes aren't there, but I will set that up at the end here and show that. on the battle board, because the battle board is kind of unique. Phase 5 is the air maintenance. So basically, the first step is returning to base. So this search plane or patrol plane, however you want to call that, goes back to its base, and its base is Midway. If the Japan patrol aircraft had failed, then it would go back to one of the cruisers that's designated as its host. You can use, or Japan can use, attack bombers, which is the torpedo bombers, as search planes from the carriers, but they operate a slightly different. They go off this fuel marker thing, so they can't. The patrol aircraft can stay aflight until they fail their mission, and then they have to come home. So the patrol aircraft that come off carriers could only stay on the air for 3 turns. Burn fuel. So basically, you're taking this 2 fuel marker and changing it out for the 3. So both those flight groups only have 2 more turns in the air before they either have to attack, which expends all their fuel, or they have to go back. And the battery is flashing at me. The last thing you would do, or the next thing, is rearm bombers. So if this guy was down here, he could refuel. If you had bombers that needed torpedoes or bombs, you could add them. 5.4 is all the planes go down below. And then that's the end of the turn. And that's the end of my battery. While I was explaining phase 5, the battery died in the camera. So I put everything back, and we'll go through that over again. And as I was doing that, it occurred to me that one thing that needed to be cleared up on these tokens is if these 2 carriers in this C zone, in this carrier division, wanted to launch its planes, 5 from each carrier, it only cost 1 command token to do so, because they are considered in one flight group. So they could launch 10 planes, and head towards the U.S. planes. The U.S., it required them to have 2 command tokens, because their carriers start individually in task force. You can move them around, but it's going to take a lot of tokens, command tokens, to do that. But they come out as one carrier per task force. So, when you launch one, it costs a token. When you launch the second one, it costs another token. And then, like I said, to land, there's no tokens that are costed there. So I thought maybe I would emphasize the token usage for the different carriers or the different groups. And then at some point Japan could split these up too, and then it would cost 1 to launch from each carrier. But as long as they're together, and you can have a maximum of 2 capital ships per sea zone, so that's the most you could have in a carrier group, would be 2. So the first phase, our first step of phase 4, which is conduct combat, is invade the island. So if the Japanese transports, and there are 2 groups of 8, make it all the way to this sea zone, they automatically get to invade the island. And you get 1 victory point for every 2 Japanese transports that invade the island. So, right here, if these 6 make it here, that would be 3 victory points. And you can attack them as the U.S., on the way, because they start at the far side of the map, and it takes at least 5 turns to get across the map, provided you get the tokens to do so. So that is kind of a priority, because that's a quick way for Japan to score some victory points. The second part of the phase is an air combat. And what that is if out in the middle of the ocean, you have planes in the same sea zone, if one side only has fighters, they may attempt to interdict the other flight, whether it has fighters and bombers. If both sets of airplanes have fighters and bombers, then there's no interdiction, because they're the assumption is the fighters wouldn't leave their bombers alone to go attack the other planes. So that hasn't happened yet in any of the games that we've played, but it is there. And then the third part is the actual battle board where you conduct combat, and there's two types. There is air combat, which you see set up here, and I'll explain that. And then there's a naval combat, and you just place the boards end to end as such, and you'll see in each of these zones, this is the destroyers, cruisers, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, aircraft carriers, battleships, and then they fight, 3 rounds of combat based off the colors as they face until you get all the ships in on the final third roll. So that way, the naval battles is kind of important for Japan, as it seems like most of the games we've played, when the U.S. has won, there's been no naval battles, and the U.S. air power pretty much wipes Japan off the map. So you need some luck, and you need some naval battles for Japan for this game. But like I said, the games we've played, I think it's been 50-50. Japan winning half and the U.S. winning the other half. So the setup here is a typical air battle, and you've got 3 groups, flight groups, 1 from each carrier, and that's just for the demonstration. They're attacking this carrier group. It had 2 fighters up for combat air patrol, so this outer ring is destroyers only. Now they only have 4, but there's 5 zones, so there's 1 zone completely unprotected. So what you do as the U.S. player, for the first ones, you're going to roll a dice. You got a 3, so this green one is going to come in at the air zone marked here, 3 to 5. So the second one is a 5, so they're also going to come in, and that's good. So let's move them over there. The worst thing you can do is come in all over the place, and that happens. And then the last one is 12, so they come down here, so the torpedo bombers come in on the side where there's no defense. So like the naval battle, this is going to be 3 rounds of combat based off the 3 rings. There's nothing in this sea zone or this battle zone here, so there's no battle. In this battle zone, there are 3 dive bombers, a Japanese destroyer and a Japanese fighter. So it's a simultaneous roll, so even though it's anti-aircraft coming from the destroyer, the U.S. plane, if they wish, they could attack, drop their bombs and attack that, but there's no victory points for that, so no need to do that. So you're going to fly through that zone. So you'd have there's a hit for the destroyer. Fighters defend at 5, bombers and torpedo bombers are a 1. So right there's 1 loss for the U.S., so we'll take that green one off. They do have 3 bombers all at 1. They got a 1, so it has to be the fighter that comes off because they didn't drop their bombs on the destroyer there. So that's bad news for Japan there, because now this next turn the ships don't move but the planes do. So the plane, if they had both planes, they could keep tracking them back. So here, obviously, the smart move here is to go into this zone with no ships and no planes, because you just killed the plane. So they go into there. So they have only 1 choice, is here. So there's a cruiser with an anti-aircraft gun, gets 1. So the anti-aircraft has scored 2 hits so far. But that's how this goes. So the third round, this fighter will come back and defend with the carriers, and in go the planes. So the carriers, and I'm going to have to look, because all the Japanese carriers are different on their anti-aircraft attacks. The Kaga is 2 at 6, and the Akagi is 2 at 4. So you would roll 2 at 6, got 1 hit. the Kaga or the Kagi, 2 at 4, gets another hit. So there's 2 hits. Well, you would lose your torpedo bomber because they attack at less. So all you got left now is 1 dive bomber, and it's not over yet because now the fighter and the bomber have to square off. So the fighter rolls a 5, gone. That attack got to drop 0 bombs on either of the Japanese carrier, and that is very accurate as to how the first fights of that Midway battle went in real life. So, but you kind of get the gist from there how the battle board works, and I kind of like the idea because you don't know, you're rolling sporadically to where the attackers are coming in at. Defense you can set up and then consolidate your combat air patrol fighters, you know, and back in, and unless of course you lose one. So at the end of that phase you would score any victory points. So say those dive bombers scored the 4 hits needed to sink this carrier, then they would get 1 victory. Or no, they would, let's see what the Kagi is. Like I said, all the Japanese carriers are different on their. The Akagi is worth 4 victory points. So that would be the carrier they would have attacked out of these 2. And they have a hit point of 4. So 4 hits, that's gone. The US has 4 victory points. And then Japan would have had 3 for landing on Midway if that scenario would have played out. And then you would move on to phase 5, which we already covered. So now the next part of combat theater, we will actually get into some gameplay, and hopefully this rules and overview was not too boring for you.